everyone, so we're doing another level 4 video, and this is all about the distance formula. And so for number 1, we want to find n so that the distance between a and b is n plus 6. So we want the distance to be n plus 6, so we take that distance and we set it equal to the distance formula between these 2 points. So I'm going to label my points x1, y1, x2, y2. And the distance formula would be x2 minus x1 minus a negative 3 is really a plus, squared, and then plus your y2 minus y1 squared. Now, with the distance formula, it doesn't matter if you do x1 minus x2 and y1 minus y2, it's all the same. So now if we have a variable underneath our square root, what we actually need to do is we need to get that variable out of the square root, and how we do this is we square both sides of our equation. When I square an n plus 6, we FOIL. So an n plus 6 times an n plus 6 is the same as an n squared plus a 6n plus another 6n plus a 12. We learned this in algebra. So then you would get an n, sorry, not a 12. I apologize. That's a 36. So then we would end up with an n squared plus a 12n plus a 36. There is a shortcut to squaring a binomial, and how we do that is we square our first term, n squared, we multiply these two terms together and then multiply by 2, so a 6 times an n is a 6n, and then multiplying by 2, I get that 12n, and then we square the last term, which is a 36, which is exactly what I got when I FOILed, but it's just a shortcut method, and you can use the shortcut method. However, I do want to address that a lot of times students do an n plus 6 squared, and they're like, okay, that's an n squared plus a 36. Please do not make that mistake. That is my biggest pet peeve, because a lot of students make that mistake. And an n plus 6 squared is the same as an n plus 6 times an n plus 6, and we did learn how to FOIL last year. And you should remember how to do everything that you learned last year in algebra. All right, so even though we're reviewing some concepts, we may not review all concepts, but you do still need to know how to do all the algebra skills from last year. And then we've done squaring a square root before. The only thing that happens when you square a square root is the square root just disappears, and everything that was underneath the square root just remains the same. Okay. So on this side, I'm just going to leave it as an n squared plus a 12n plus a 36. Now, the 5 plus 3 squared, I don't need a FOIL because I can actually simplify a 5 plus 3. A 5 plus 3 is an 8. Squared is a 64. And then plus the n minus 2 squared, don't be tempted to do an n squared plus a 4. That comes out to be, if we do the shortcut, we square our first term, so an n squared. We multiply these two together, and n times a negative 2 is a negative 2n, and then we multiply that by 2, so it becomes a negative 4n, and then we square the last term, and negative 2 squared is a positive 4. All right, on both sides, you should see an n squared. If I subtract n squared from both sides, guess what? The n squareds disappear, and this is not a quadratic equation, so it kind of looked like it was a quadratic equation, but it ended up not being one. So then on the left side, I'm left with a 12n plus a 36, and that's equal to a 64 plus a 4 is a 68, and then I have that minus 4n, and now I just solve for n. So I'm going to add 4n to both sides, so I wind up with a 16n plus a 36 is equal to a 68. I'm now going to subtract 36 from both sides. So I wind up with a 16n is equal to a 32. and then I divide by 16 on both sides. So n comes out to be a value of 2, and that's what they wanted you to find. They wanted you to find n. So that's how we would do that problem. Now number 2, the point A is equidistance from B and C. So what that means, if I take the distance, equidistance means equal distance. So if I take the distance from point A to B, that distance formula is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. That distance should be equal to the distance from A to C. So using that distance formula, x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Now if I look back at this entire equation, I do see a variable underneath the square root. And I can't have it under the square root, otherwise I can't solve for it. So to get that out of the square root, I need to square both sides of this equation. And the reason why I need to square both sides is because I cannot change the value of this equation. And if I do one thing to one side of an equation, I need to do it to the other, so it's equal. And so the first side squared, all that happens is the square root goes away, and I just rewrite everything underneath my square root. And my second side, same thing. If I square something that's underneath the square root, my square root just goes away, and I write everything underneath my square root. Okay, and x minus 1 squared, remember we need to FOIL or do the shortcut. The shortcut is I square the first term, I multiply these two terms together, so a negative 1 times an x is a negative 1x, and then I multiply by 2, so I get a negative 2x, and then I square my last term, a negative 1 squared is a positive 1. And then plus, a 7 minus a 4 is a 3, a 3 squared is a 9, so I have plus a 9, and that equals, on this side, a 3 minus a 1 is a 2 squared is a 4, and then here, a 1 minus a 4 is a negative 3 squared is a 9. Combining like terms. A 1 plus a 9 is a 10 here, and a 4 plus a 9 is a 13. Now, unfortunately, the x squared does not go away on this. So what this means is that this is a quadratic equation, so we're solving a quadratic equation. And when we solve quadratic equations, we need to set it equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract this 13 over. When I do that, I get an x squared minus a 2x minus a 3 is equal to a 0. I'm going to attempt to do the box method here. So with the box method, two numbers when multiplied, or I'm going to split up my x, and two numbers when multiplied together equal negative 3, but when added together equal negative 2, would be a negative 3 and a 1. That does not mean that x is negative 3 and 1, because remember, we need to do the binomials x minus 3 and x plus 1 and set that equal to 0. And then if we solve both of these for 0, we would get x is 3 and negative 1. Now, x is part of a coordinate. And a coordinate can be positive or negative. It's not a distance here. Distances cannot be negative. But x here is a coordinate, or part of a coordinate. And part of a coordinate can be negative, so both these answers work. We need to keep both of them. All right, the last problem on this video is number 3. It says to find A if the line passing through these 2 points is perpendicular to that line that's given to you. So I need to find the slope of the line that's given to us. So I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. Actually, there's an easier way to go about this one. The 3x and the 1 can stay. I can just add y to both sides, and that isolates y. Look at that. Easy peasy. Try to do as the least amount of work as possible. So my slope of this line is 3. So the slope of the line that's perpendicular to this would be negative 1/3. So if I take that negative 1/3, I need to attach it to either the 1 or the 3, not to both. That will equal the slope between these 2 points. So I'm going to label these 2 points x1, y1, x2, y2. And now just do the slope formula. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Simplifying, I get a negative 1/3 is equal to a 5 minus an a over a 2. And then to solve for a, this is a proportion, so I cross multiply. A negative 1 times a 2 is a negative 2. Then I put an equal sign, and a 3 times a 5 minus an a would be a 15 minus a 3a. Now I just solve for a by subtracting 15 from both sides. I get a negative 17 is equal to a negative 3a, and dividing by negative 3 on both sides, I get a is a positive 17/3. I'm just going to leave it like that. It doesn't come out nicely. Please do not round your answer. Leave it as a fraction. If you want to write this as a mixed number, that's fine, because it's not a slope. It is part of a coordinate. All right, that brings us to the end of video 2 for level 4.